The family reunion was being held at the Beaumont summer home, a sprawling estate overlooking a pristine lake. The house was enormous, a monument to the family's self-proclaimed success, with its marble columns, vaulted ceilings, and perfectly manicured lawns. I had been invited begrudgingly, as I was every year, and as always, I arrived last. It wasn't an accident. I knew they'd already be clustered together, sipping cocktails and swapping stories about their latest accomplishments, primed and ready to look down on me. As I walked onto the back patio, all heads turned in my direction. "Ah, look who decided to grace us with their presence," sneered Diana, my cousin and the unofficial leader of the family's social hierarchy. Her voice carried, drawing the attention of the others. "We were beginning to think you wouldn't show up. Or maybe you were just waiting for the bar to open." Laughter rippled through the group, and I forced a polite smile, giving no indication that her jab had landed. "Still living in that studio apartment," chimed in Edward, her younger brother, a man who loved the sound of his own voice. "What's it like having to decide between paying rent and buying groceries?" I ignored him, heading for the drink table. It wasn't worth engaging, not yet. The jabs kept coming as the evening progressed. During dinner, they made a point of discussing my fall from grace. "It's such a shame," Diana said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You had so much potential back in school. What happened? Was it the drinking? Or the other thing?" She trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. "You know, Diana," Edward cut in, smirking. "It's not polite to bring up the past. Our dear cousin has clearly moved on to, well, whatever it is they're doing these days." "What is it, anyway? Part-time retail? Freelance writing?" I stayed silent, eating my meal as their laughter buzzed around me. They thought they knew everything about me, but they didn't. I had let them believe the worst all these years because it was easier than explaining the truth. After dinner, the family gathered in the living room for their usual game of one-upmanship. Edward was boasting about his latest business venture, a tech startup that he claimed was on the verge of securing a massive round of funding. Diana countered with tales of her glamorous European vacation, peppering her story with details about the exclusive parties she had attended. The rest of the family chimed in with their own accomplishments, each story more exaggerated than the last. "And what about you?" Diana asked, turning to me with a wicked smile. "Surely you've done something worth sharing. Or have you just been keeping busy?" The room fell silent, all eyes on me. It was a trap, of course. Anything I said would be met with thinly veiled contempt or outright mockery. "I've been keeping busy," I said simply, taking a sip of my wine. Diana's smile widened. "I'm sure you have. Well, at least you're not causing any more scandals. We were all so worried about you after, you know." She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's not every day someone walks away from a promising career in disgrace. But I suppose we all make mistakes." Laughter broke out again, and I leaned back in my chair, watching them. They were so sure of their superiority, so confident that they had the upper hand. But they didn't know, the opportunity presented itself later in the evening, when Edward brought up his tech startup again. "We're so close to closing the deal," he said, practically vibrating with excitement. "It's going to be huge. Once we lock in the funding, it'll put us on the map." "What kind of funding are you looking for?" I asked casually, my tone neutral. He turned to me, clearly surprised that I had spoken up. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," I said. "What's the figure?" "10 million, he said proudly. "We've already got a few interested parties, but we're holding out for the right partner." "Interesting," I said, setting down my glass. "Because I'm one of those interested parties." The room went silent. Edward stared at me, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about my investment firm," I said, pulling a folder from my bag and placing it on the coffee table. "The one you've been pitching to for the past 6 months. You didn't recognize my name on the correspondence, did you?" "It's my firm, Edward. I own it." The silence deepened, and I could feel the tension radiating through the room. Edward opened the folder with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the documents inside. His face turned pale as realization dawned. This can't be right," he stammered. You're broke. It started small, almost embarrassingly so. My job at the cafe wasn't glamorous, but it gave me access to something invaluable, insight into the food and beverage industry. I spent my breaks poring over books on entrepreneurship, marketing, and finance, borrowing titles from the local library because I couldn't afford to buy them. My evenings were spent attending free webinars, watching endless YouTube tutorials, and networking at local small business meetups. At one of those meetups, I met an older woman named Celeste who had successfully run a catering business for 20 years before retiring. She became my first mentor, offering advice and encouragement when I felt like giving up. "Start with what you know," she told me one night over coffee. "And build from there. Focus on quality, and the customers will come." Taking her words to heart, I decided to focus on something I was truly passionate about: specialty baked goods. I had always loved baking, and I knew there was a market for unique, handcrafted items. With my modest savings, I rented space in a shared commercial kitchen and started experimenting with recipes. My first batch of lemon lavender shortbread cookies was a hit among my coworkers at the cafe, who encouraged me to sell them. But selling them wasn't as simple as I'd hoped. I couldn't afford a storefront, so I began by setting up a booth at the local farmers market. It was humiliating at first. I'd see acquaintances pass by, their expressions tinged with pity or derision as they realized I was hawking cookies out of a tent. Over the next year, I worked harder than I ever thought possible. I was up at 4 a.m. every day to bake and at the market by 7 a.m. to set up my booth. After the market closed, I spent hours promoting my business on social media, reaching out to potential clients, and refining my recipes. I lived on almost no sleep, eating leftovers from the cafe to save money. Gradually, the hard work began to pay off. My cookies became a hit at the market, and customers started asking if I catered for events. I saw an opportunity and seized it, offering custom dessert tables for weddings, corporate parties, and birthdays. Word spread, and before I knew it, I had more orders than I could handle on my own. I hired my first employee, a part-time baker, and invested in better equipment. Then, with a small business loan and the savings I had so painstakingly built, I opened my first brick-and-mortar bakery. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and it was enough to silence the nagging voice in my head that said I wasn't good enough. Behind the scenes, I had partnered with a local distributor to get my products into high-end grocery stores. My social media following had exploded, and I was negotiating a deal with a major retailer to carry my frozen dough nationwide. By the time my second bakery opened on the other side of town, I had tripled my revenue and was fielding offers from investors. I turned most of them down, preferring to keep control of my brand. The turning point came when I was invited to speak at a local entrepreneurial summit. My story caught the attention of a journalist, who wrote a glowing feature about my business in the city's most prominent lifestyle magazine. I used the success and opened my own investment firm, focusing on underdog entrepreneurs with ideas as underestimated as I had once been. My firm grew rapidly, attracting major clients and partnerships, and within a few years, it became one of the most respected names in the industry. Diana was the next to speak, her voice sharp. "This is some kind of joke. You expect us to believe that you've been running a company this whole time?" "I don't care what you believe," I said. "The documents speak for themselves. And for the record, Edward, I've decided not to invest in your startup. You'll need to find your funding elsewhere." Edward's face crumpled, and the room erupted into chaos. Diana demanded answers, Edward pleaded with me to reconsider, and the rest of the family looked on in stunned silence. I let them talk, saying nothing as they scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. Eventually, I stood and headed for the door. "Thank you for the lovely evening," I said, turning back to face them one last time. "It's always a pleasure catching up with family." As I walked out of the house, their voices followed me, a cacophony of shock, anger, and disbelief. I smiled to myself, knowing they would never look at me the same way again.
Like and subscribe.